Perhaps we can start. Okay, sorry. You will go on. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to 5th Zienkiewicz Lecture. My name is Perumal Nithiyarasu. I chair the Zienkiewicz Lecture Committee. We are delighted to have Baroness Brown of Cambridge as a speaker today. Let me briefly introduce other panel members. We have Professor Helen Griffiths, Pro Vice Chancellor at Swansea University, with me, and Ken Meisner, Pro Vice Chancellor, as well as Executive Dean of Faculty of Science and Engineering. Then Professor Howell Thomas, who is a distinguished research professor at Swansea University. We have Samantha Board and from Swansea University supporting, as well as Sarah Morse kindly supporting this event from Learned Society of Wales. And Charlie is providing background support. Finally, our speaker obviously will be properly introduced by my colleague very soon. Before I hand over to Professor Helen Griffiths, let me briefly say a few words about this lecture. As I mentioned, this is a 5th lecture. We had 4 previous lectures. The proposal was approved by the Swansea University Senate a while ago to honor Professor Zienkiewicz's contribution to engineering research. If you are not familiar with Professor Zienkiewicz, just briefly, he came to Swansea in 1961 after 2 academic positions, one in University of Edinburgh and one in Northwestern University, to come to Swansea to lead Department of Civil Engineering. And that's a kind of the starting point of finite element research in Swansea. He led the finite element research. I think, and those days, kind of finite element is kind of starting. You know, everybody's trying to figure that out, how to really do modeling, and that led to the first ever textbook authored by Zienkiewicz in 1967. Professor Zienkiewicz continued the research, and there were lots of milestones. I think I have to really mention my colleagues, Professor Roland Lewis and Professor Ken Morgan, as well as late Professor Roger Owen. I think together they kind of did quite lots of work, including first ever full simulation, aircraft simulation from Swansea in the 80s, and field problems, etc. So those who are familiar with the finite element methods know that every engineering industry now use finite element method in their analysis. So that's kind of that effort started in Swansea. And Professor Zienkiewicz is known as one of the 3 founding fathers of the finite element method. So, you know, the impact, as a result of this impact, we really thought a few years ago, we have to really do something to honor Professor Zienkiewicz's contribution that led to creating this public lecture. We all feel that this is a fitting tribute to somebody who made such a contribution and made a huge impact in the industry. With that brief introduction, I'm now going to hand over to Professor Helen Griffiths to introduce our distinguished speaker today.
Thank you very much indeed, Arasu. It's indeed my honour and my pleasure to welcome Baroness Brown of Cambridge and introduce her to you as our guest speaker for the Zienkiewicz Lecture of 2021. Baroness Brown is an engineer with a wealth of senior leadership experience in universities, industries, and latterly in the House of Lords. Moving between sectors, she's brought unparalleled insights, particularly on the importance of cross-sector working to tackle the world's biggest challenges, such as the climate emergency. Following a successful career at Cambridge University, Baroness Brown held senior business positions and engineering roles at Rolls-Royce plc before returning to academia as Principal of Engineering at Imperial College. Between 2006 and 2016, she was Vice-Chancellor of Aston University. I had the privilege of working with Julia's senior team as she shared her passion for education, employability, diversity, and innovation. Her vision and leadership transformed the university into the proud and purposeful university that it is today. In 2015, she was elevated to the peerage as the Baroness Brown of Cambridge, where she's a crossbench peer and a member of the House of Lords Science and Technology Select Committee. Her current interests focus on climate change and adaptation and mitigation and the low carbon economy. She's served as Vice Chair of the Climate Change Committee for over 12 years, from 2008, and continues to chair its Adaptation Committee. She's Chair of the Carbon Trust and Non-Executive Director of Ørsted. She was formerly a Non-Executive Director of the Green Investment Bank, led the King Review on Decarbonising Transport in 2008, and was the Prime Minister's Low Carbon Business Ambassador for 10 years until 2019. She also advises the government on its hydrogen strategy as a member of the Hydrogen Advisory Council. Baroness Brown, we're delighted to welcome you today and look forward to hearing your lecture entitled Delivering Net Zero, the Challenges Ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, and lovely to see you again after all that time at Aston. So let me just share my slides and keep my fingers crossed that nothing goes wrong here. Great. Well, apologies for the slight change in title of the lecture. One agrees to do these things so far in advance, you can never quite remember what you said it was going to be called by the time you get to putting the slides together. But I think the content will cover what you might be expecting from either title. So let me just start by reminding us, as if we needed reminding this year, that the climate is already changing. There are all sorts of data sets that show us how the climate is changing. This one happens to be one of my favorites. It's one of my favorites because I am just amazed that people have been recording since the early 800s the date of full flowering cherry blossom day in Kyoto. And since the early 800s, the day of full flowering the date of full flowering cherry blossom day, bit of a tongue twister that, has moved by somewhere between 15 and 20 days. So it now occurs 15 to 20 days earlier than it did. And all of that change has occurred since the early 1900s. So from 800 to 1900, it just oscillated about the same date. And since then, it's moved by more than half a month. Perhaps the more familiar way we look at how the climate is changing is by looking at the increase in the average global temperature. And these are data from the Met Office. And these show that since about the 1920s, the temperature has been going continuously up. And as you can see, in recent years, it's been going up very fast. Indeed, the last 10 years have been the hottest 10 years on record. So this is that same data again, because we're going to look into the future. So in Paris, back in 2015, it was agreed by most of the countries in the world that we would aim to keep temperature rise by the end of the century down to below 2 degrees. And if possible, we would strive to make efforts to keep it below 1.5. As you can see, we're already pretty close to 1.5. If we manage to keep it to below 2, which would be pretty much by having most of the world on a pathway to net zero by around the middle of the century, then this is the kind of temperature rise. These are the kind of annual temperatures we might see. This is the Met Office's forward projections. And what you notice is that between now and 2050, the temperature goes on rising as fast as it has been rising for the last 10 years. So the last 10 years may have been the hottest 10 years on record, but every decade between now and 2050 is likely to be the hottest 10 years on record. And then if we hit net zero in 2050, the temperature will start to stabilize and not continue to rise. So that would be a reasonably good outcome. It's not as good as 1.5 degrees, but it's a reasonably good outcome in terms of what we might be able to achieve. Unfortunately, in terms of where we're going at the moment, we're more likely to achieve something in this sort of range. And that would mean temperatures potentially increasing by more than 4 degrees to the end of the century. That would mean every decade to the end of the century being the hottest decade on record. And that is really somewhere that we don't need to go. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change around the world. And in fact, you might have thought that 2021 was trying to send a message to our leaders at the recent COP meeting in Glasgow. We've had extraordinary scenes of extreme flooding, extreme temperatures, extreme wildfires all over the world, and droughts as well. And the top picture is the flooding in Germany and Belgium that killed over 200 people. That was a weather system that could easily have stopped over the UK, and that could have been weather that we experienced here this year. And we certainly will experience weather like that. I can't tell you when, but that's the sort of thing that is going to be becoming much, much more common as the climate changes. We're also really starting to see the cost of these climatic events. The green, blue, and yellow bars, parts of the bars in this data, show you the events that are related to the climate. The cost of those events to the insurance industry is estimated to have been about $357 billion, in the decade of 1980 to 1989. But in the most recent decade, that's gone up to nearly $1.5 trillion, and that's going to go on increasing. So there's a huge human cost, and there's a really rapidly growing financial cost to these changes in the climate. And we've been experiencing the climate change here in the UK. I come from Cambridge, and down in the southeast, we've been seeing temperatures rising, the hottest temperatures rising now at about 1 degree per decade. And indeed, in 2019 in Cambridge, we saw temperatures approaching 40 degrees, the highest ever temperature recorded in the UK in the Botanic Garden. So hotter temperatures are coming. That will mean that our homes become more and more uncomfortable to live in the summer. Here's an example of some office buildings converted into flats in London. And in the heatwave summer of 2018, the temperatures inside the flats that didn't have any form of blinds or shading approached 50 degrees centigrade. Those are really dangerous temperatures. A baby asleep or an elderly person or someone with asthma in one of those rooms could have died. So there's really a very strong message here that we have to start making sure that our buildings are fit for the future climate. We also need to recognize that climate change will bring growing pressures on our water system. So if we're on that 2 degree path, then we will see an increase in likelihood of drought. But if we're on a 4 degree path, then things start to look very much worse. And even parts of Wales start to feel quite significant water shortages. We'll also see much wetter weather. And I should actually just remind everybody that this week is Flood Action Week. And we are being predicted by the Met Office that we're going to have a particularly wet winter, a warm and wet winter this year. And the Environment Agency, I think today or this week, published their recent survey that showed that 60% of people who live today in areas at risk of flooding don't think flooding will happen to them. Flooding, as they saw in Germany and Belgium earlier this year, is something we have to take seriously, and it's going to get worse as the climate changes. So we already have 1.8 million people living in areas at significant risk of flooding in the UK, and about 5 million people in areas at flood risk. Those numbers will increase even if we're on that 2-degree path towards the end of the century. So we all need to be thinking about how well prepared we are for future flooding. Nature is suffering from the change in climate as well. This is some data from Germany. We haven't seen data like this from the UK, but if it's arrived in Germany, then these problems, we can be confident, are with us already, and we'll be seeing them in more obvious ways in years to come. So the trees in Germany are increasingly being damaged by heavy winter rainfall, heat and drought in the summer, and new pests and diseases attracted by the warmer conditions, such as bark beetles. And the data from Germany are really alarming, with around 80% of their common trees now affected by the changes in the climate, and growing costs for looking at replacing those trees and planting the right kind of trees that will be able to survive in the future climatic conditions. So we all have to accept that even if we achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement, climate change is still going to go on till the middle of the century. And we're likely to see in the UK another 0.5 degree or so of warming by 2050, probably taking us over the 1.5 degrees already. We're going to see heat wave summers like 2018 becoming a typical summer by the mid-century. Summer rainfall will reduce. It could reduce by as much as 24%. Winter rainfall will increase. It could increase by as much as 16%. And much of that rain, or much more of that rain, will come in short bursts of extremely heavy rain, the sort of rain that leads to surface water flooding in our towns and our cities. And the sea level will continue to rise, giving rise to more coastal flooding and erosion around our coastline. So even if we're on that path to net zero, we need to be prepared for these changes to come. And so whilst we talk a lot about reducing emissions, we call that mitigation, we also need to talk about adaptation. Reducing emissions reduces the climate hazard, so it reduces the amount of warming and the consequences of that warming, like the changes in the weather and the wildfires. But adaptation looks at how exposed you are to that climate hazard and how vulnerable you are to that climate hazard. So, for example, are you living on the coast, so you're exposed to coastal flooding? Are you particularly vulnerable? So perhaps you're elderly and can't move very quickly, or you're ill and will be particularly affected, for example, by very high temperatures inside buildings. So while mitigation tries to reduce the hazard by reducing our emissions, adaptation looks at reducing people's exposure and reducing their vulnerability, because it's the combination of the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability that actually leads to the climate impacts, whether that's people's deaths or whether that's economic losses or whatever it is. So when we think about addressing climate change, we must always think about doing these two things, about mitigating, but also about adapting. So I'm mainly going to be talking about reducing emissions, because that was mainly what they were talking about at COP26. But I'll come back at the end to remind you that adaptation is important as well. So there's a long history of our understanding of climate change. We've known about this for really quite a long time. Back in 1820, FREng realized that in order to understand the temperature at the Earth's surface, you had to believe that the atmosphere retained heat, that the atmosphere behaved as a blanket, keeping the Earth warm. And he had to put a coefficient. He didn't understand it, but he had to put a coefficient in to account for the heat that was retained by the Earth's atmosphere. In 1856, and it's nice to see a woman featuring on this list, an American woman scientist and women's rights activist actually observed that it was CO2 in the atmosphere that was causing global temperatures to rise. Now, this piece of work is normally accredited to Tyndall because he published something about this, showing that it was the minority gases, things we now call the greenhouse gases, that absorb heat, and these gases are present in small quantities, parts per million, for example, of CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's only certain gases in the atmosphere that act in this way to keep the planet warmer. By the end of the 19th century, Arrhenius was looking at burning fossil fuels, and he could calculate that a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere would give us a 5-degree temperature rise. Well, if we look at Arrhenius's calculation today, comparing the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're now up to about 413. Arrhenius would predict that temperature would have risen by about 1.7 degrees. It's actually risen by about 1.2 degrees, but Arrhenius wasn't doing a sophisticated calculation looking at how much heat was being absorbed by the ocean. He was doing a very simple calculation. So I think that's remarkably close to where we are today. So we've known about this for a very long time, but it took until 2008 for the UK to become the first country to legislate for the emissions reduction we were going to deliver. So in the Climate Change Act passed at the end of 2008, we legislated to reduce our emissions by 80% based on a 1990 baseline by 2050. And that was a global first. Unfortunately now, many other countries have followed in our footsteps. But then in 2015, we had the momentous COP meeting in Glasgow, where 196 countries, the increase in global average temperature, aim to limit it to no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. So that was a really historic agreement. And since then, we've had a number of really important publications, particularly reports from the IPCC showing the major benefits of keeping below 1.5 degrees versus keeping below 2 degrees. We've had a number of important reports in the UK, such as those from the Climate Change Committee. In 2019, the Climate Change Committee published a report showing that the UK could get not only to an 80% reduction, but to net zero by 2050, and that it actually would be no more expensive because the cost of technologies had already come down so fast since the Climate Change Act was passed. And on that basis, the UK was again the first country to amend our Climate Change Act to change the 80% target to a 100% target reduction. Since then, we've had more reports from the IPCC, really stressing the fact that human activity is changing the climate, and that actually we're seeing more extreme changes in climate than we might have been expecting. We've had the government publish our net zero strategy, saying how we're going to get to net zero by 2050. And of course, we've had the COP meeting in Glasgow at the beginning of this month, where it wasn't quite the singing from the rooftops success that many of us would have liked to see. But we did come out with the agreement that countries wanted to keep the prospect of 1.5 degrees alive. We haven't yet got the commitments to reducing emissions that will do that, but we have a commitment to try and make sure we move forward to do that. So some good has come out of COP26 in Glasgow, and we will look to next year's COP in Egypt to see countries coming back with better proposals, tougher emissions reductions. So why are we aiming to achieve net zero by 2050 in the UK? The IPCC analysis actually suggests that to have a chance of, have a more than 50% chance of keeping below 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, that the world probably needs to get to net zero by 2070. That's the red line on this chart in the pink, within the pink band of outcomes. So why have we gone for this earlier date of 2050? And indeed, why are so many of the rich countries focusing on 2050? Well, the Paris Agreement was all about the highest possible ambition in the light of national circumstances. So the Paris Agreement recognized that rich developed countries should be reducing their emissions faster than the developing world. And the UK clearly is a rich developed country that has demonstrated that it can be more ambitious. If you look at how our GDP has grown in comparison with the G7, the richest countries of which we're a member of that group, our GDP has grown at about the same rate as the rest of them. Our economy has grown at about the same rate as the rest of them since 1990, whereas we've managed to reduce our emissions by 42% versus 3 or 4% by the rest of, on average, for the rest of the G7. So we've shown that we can actually continue to grow our economy whilst reducing our emissions pretty fast in the UK. However, we're also a very rich economy that grew rich on the Industrial Revolution and indeed on creating those early emissions that have been causing climate change. So we have a large historic obligation, if you like, to go faster than some of the developing countries. And we have a large carbon footprint. So because we import a lot, our consumption emissions are significantly larger than our territorial emissions. And all of the agreements at the COPs at Paris are based on accounting of the emissions you produce in the country, not the emissions you consume. So our carbon footprint is much bigger than our territorial emissions. So other people are creating emissions in order to provide us with goods. And lots of people think that that's something that we should take into account. And as you can see, our consumption emissions are not falling as fast as our territorial emissions. So that's another reason why we should be being more ambitious than less affluent societies. And a third reason is that we're in a good position to cost reduce the key technologies that will be needed globally for addressing net zero. So we can become a supplier of them to the world, but we can also help the rest of the world by enabling them to access those technologies at lower cost. And a brilliant example of that is offshore wind. It was only in 2014 that we thought offshore wind in terms of energy generation was going to be costing about £150 a megawatt hour. Only 5 years later, in 2019, in what's called the Contracts for Difference auction round, the electricity generators were suggesting that they could generate electricity from offshore wind at less than £40 per megawatt hour. So much cheaper than the current standard that we use, which is a combined cycle gas turbine generating electricity in the UK. So in a period of 5 years, the technology had advanced, the size of the offshore wind turbines had grown so much that costs had come down by about a factor of 4. So an amazing story of technology development and cost reduction. And of course, we've seen similar amazing stories for things like batteries and solar cells, some of the other really key technologies that are going to be part of achieving net zero globally. So what about our path to net zero in the UK? Well, first of all, I think it's just worth noting that this shows where we have been, how emissions have been coming down to around about 2018. The red dotted line shows schematically what it looked like to get to an 80% reduction, and the green dotted line shows just schematically how much faster we're going to have to reduce our emissions to get to 100% reduction. So in 2019, when the legislation changed, the challenge got significantly tougher. And here's where we were in 2019. Fortunately, that's before COVID, so it's not confused by all of the different behaviors we've seen during lockdown. But it's, of those different lines, each color is a different sector of the economy. You can see the only sector that looks as if it's coming down towards zero is the power sector, electricity generation. And that's because we've taken coal off the electricity generating system, and now we're starting to put more and more renewables on. So we may well get our power system down to net zero in an appropriate time. The two real problem areas for us are the blue and the orange ones going through the middle. So that's surface transport, so things like cars and buses and vans, and heat in buildings, all of that in gas we burn in our gas boilers, heating most of the homes and buildings in Britain. And as you can see, those two lines don't look as if they're going anywhere near turning around and approaching zero. So we have some real challenges in decarbonising our economy, as I think this chart shows. Well, when we were aiming at reducing our emissions by 80%, we needed to do things like energy efficiency and reducing demand. We needed to look at how we could replace fossil fuels with clean electricity. So using electricity for heating our homes, using electricity for transporting electric vehicles, using electricity in industry, growing our zero carbon power generation system. So lots more renewable power generation, starting to develop carbon capture and storage for those industrial processes that we couldn't electrify, looking at ways to sequester carbon. So for example, by using wood in long-term construction, limited implementation of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Oops, sorry about that. Which should be able to give us a certain degree of negative carbon emissions, and planting lots more trees in order to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. But all of those actions still left us with quite a big chunk of emissions. And in particular, those emissions were in industry, from industrial processes, from heating buildings, from heavy transport, things that were hard to electrify, and in challenging areas like aviation, shipping, and agriculture. But at an 80% reduction, we didn't have to worry about getting all of those down to zero. Now we're focusing on 100%. We really have to focus very hard on those you might call hard to reduce areas. And one of the reasons why you're hearing so much about hydrogen at the moment is because when you've got to take that last 20% of emissions out, suddenly hydrogen becomes something you want to think of. You have electrification, carbon capture and storage, and then you can replace gas with hydrogen to create, for example, high-grade heat. In buildings, we may be able to use hydrogen for heating some buildings. In really heavy vehicles traveling long distances, we may be able to use fuel cells and hydrogen. In aviation, they're looking at running gas turbines on hydrogen and also making synthetic fuels using low carbon hydrogen. In shipping, they're looking at replacing diesel with ammonia, obviously produced with hydrogen. Obviously in agriculture, we want to use low carbon hydrogen in our fertilizers. In the energy supply system, we may want to do peak lopping by using hydrogen in big gas turbines, and hydrogen is also a very useful way of storing energy over long periods. So interseasonal storage, that's very difficult to do in many ways at all. Hydro is perhaps one of them, but otherwise hydrogen is a really important and useful way of storing energy from one season to the next. So hydrogen suddenly becomes, in this net zero world, a very important part of our energy system. And indeed, in terms of delivering net zero, there are a range of things we need to do. So the top of this graph shows where we would go if business as usual were to continue. Below business as usual, we need to be reducing demand and making things more efficient. Those are the purpley coloured layers. We then need lots of take-up of new technologies. A big chunk of that is the orange bit of electrification, but then we've got hydrogen and we've got carbon capture and storage in red and yellow. To support all that electrification, we've got to have a major expansion of our zero carbon power generation energy system. And then we're left with a small chunk of emissions that we will need to offset. And hopefully we can offset as many of those as possible by planting more trees, creating new woodlands. But we may also need, and are quite likely also to need, some new technologies like direct air capture of CO2 from the atmosphere and then storing that. Underpinning that are major changes to what our energy system looks like. So by 2050, we'll need to have at least doubled our electricity system, and we may even need to have trebled it in size. This is the core scenario used by the Climate Change Committee, which suggests we need to move from today's 300 terawatt hours of electricity to something like 720 terawatt hours of electricity by 2050. We'll be dramatically reducing our use of natural gas down to about 20% of what we use today, and what we are still using will be being used to produce hydrogen with carbon capture and storage, or in industry or energy generation, but again with carbon capture and storage. We'll see even more dramatic reductions in our oil use, such that by 2050 all we're using that for is kerosene for aviation, and of course we're having to sequester the carbon to make up for those emissions. So we're having to back out those emissions in order to get to net zero. And a really significant increase, rapid growth of the production of low carbon hydrogen. We don't really produce any low carbon hydrogen today, and we need to grow that industry to something like the size of our current electricity industry by 2050. And we see much of that hydrogen being used in the grey area for industry and in the brownish coloured band for shipping in the form of ammonia. So addressing some of those hard to decarbonize areas that we see today. But I think the most dramatic thing perhaps about the energy system is how much more efficient we become in our use of energy. Today, we use in total about 2,000 terawatt hours of energy. Only 300 terawatt hours of that is in the form of electricity, and the rest of it is in the form of oil and gas. So you might say we were 15% electric today. By 2050, we'll be very much more efficient because, for example, an electric vehicle is almost 4 times more efficient in its use of energy than an internal combustion engine. So our energy use actually will drop in total, perhaps even halve to about 1,000 terawatt hours. But most of that will be electricity, and most of that will be renewable electricity. So we'll be something like 70% electric. Essentially, we'll be very much a kind of electric society. And we need to be thinking very hard about the resilience of our electricity system, because if the electricity stops for some reason, then just about everything we do will stop. So it's crucially important that we think of how the future changes in the climate, for example, will be affecting the resilience of our electricity system in the future. The scale of the change is enormous. So in the next 30 years, so for students in your working lifetimes, we've got to double or triple the size of our electricity system. We're probably going to increase the amount of offshore wind around our shores by a factor of 10 to around 100 gigawatts. To support that and all of that renewable energy, we're going to have to completely transform our electricity grid in terms of the scale of it, but actually in terms of the flexibility of it, in terms of the storage, as I've said, in terms of how resilient it is. We're going to have to grow this new hydrogen industry. We're going to have to get carbon capture and storage going. We've got nearly 30 million buildings which need to be made net zero, so they need to have their gas boilers swapped out and much better insulation. We've got to replace all of our cars with, so probably 30 to 35 million cars with EVs, and put in all of the charging infrastructure that will be needed for that. In order to get that net part of the zero, we've got to have lots of carbon sequestration. So we've got to increase the rate of forest and woodland creation by a factor of 5, and take the area of woodland and forest in the UK up to about 18%. We'll still be the lowest in Europe, I think, but it'll be a lot more than we have today. And that will require really significant changes in agriculture and indeed changes to our diet to make space for all of that new woodland and forest that we're going to need to create. So that's a lot to do in 30 years. And in some ways, it's getting tougher. It's getting tougher because almost all of the reductions that we have produced since the Climate Change Act was passed have come from industry and the electricity system. So they haven't required us as citizens to change our behavior in any significant ways. We may have a lot of renewable energy on the grid, but you turn the lights on and they still come on just as they did before. So we've been pretty much oblivious up to now to what's been happening to reduce emissions. So, we've been involved in perhaps 17% of changes in behavior or decision making contributing to reduced emissions. But, over 80% of reduction in emissions has required nothing of us. As we move forward, 60+% of what we need to do actually requires us to do things differently, to make different decisions, to be more efficient, whether that's with electricity or resources. So as we go forward, we need people to be much, much, much more engaged in the transition and to understand what they need to do and what they can do differently to be part of achieving net zero. On the other hand, there's some good news as well. And the good news is that every time we look at the cost of doing this, it gets cheaper. When Lord Stern looked at it, back in 2006, in the Stern Review, he thought it might cost about 3% of GDP. When we, in 2008, for the UK, looked at getting to an 80% reduction, we said we thought that would cost 1 to 2% of GDP. The 6th carbon budget in 2020, that had come down to 0.5% of GDP. So all of those key technologies have been getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. The offshore wind, the batteries, the solar, dramatic reductions in cost. And that's bringing the cost of making this transition down. And in fact, modelling at places like Oxford is now suggesting that it won't even cost us anything in terms of GDP. Actually, it will drive GDP growth. And we could see 2 or 3% additional GDP growth by 2050 by making the green transition. But it's getting to look very positive in terms of the costs and the benefits of making this transition. The challenge, however, for the Treasury is that a lot of this is upfront capital costs. There is a lot of upfront capital cost, and by the time we get to 2050, the operational cost savings may well exceed the upfront capital costs. But you've got to get there. There's also the challenge that most of the savings come from transport. So as I've said, the electric vehicle is so much more efficient than the internal combustion engine that you get this huge contribution to the operating cost savings coming from decarbonisation of transport. So the challenge that, of course, our Treasury has is how do you organise the tax system such that you redistribute some of the benefits in transport to the other sectors that need that have higher costs of this transition. I should also add that although this says we need some 50 billion per annum additional investment to transition to net zero, that's not all taxpayers' money. Much of that, of course, is the investment, for example, in offshore wind, which will come from UK investors, overseas investors, our pension funds, all sorts of places. That's not coming directly out of our pockets in terms of tax. That's not all money that our government has to find. So it's an interesting challenge, I think, for our Treasury, but a really important one for them to get right. So the government has just published, just before the COP, it published its net zero strategy. It's a very important piece of policy. I have to say it is a world-leading piece of policy. No other government has published yet an ambitious and comprehensive plan showing how it will get to net zero and also to the 78% reduction in emissions by 2035 that the commitment we made at COP implies, and that the 6th carbon budget of the Climate Change Committee requires. So it is ambitious, it is comprehensive, it does cover all the sectors of the UK economy, and it doesn't involve us buying any international carbon credits. So it's all about reducing emissions in the UK. And it aligns very closely with the Climate Change Committee's recommendations in a wide number of areas. So I think it genuinely is a world-leading piece of policy. It's quite high level at the moment, and it has a very strong focus on technology, very much more of a focus on technology than on anything that might involve demand reduction. So it slightly avoids that issue of how closely we are going to need to engage consumers in the transition to net zero, but it's good news for technologists. And it does talk about enabling people, but it doesn't really tell you what the government is going to do to enable people. It's kind of principles rather than specifics of action. So if I had to give it a mark, this is what I would say. The numbers along here represent the proportion of UK emissions. So surface transport is the highest proportion of UK emissions. The plans for transport, which involve things like stopping the sale of petrol and diesel fueled cars by 2030. The plans for surface transport look pretty good and align very closely with what the Climate Change Committee thinks needs to happen. The plans for buildings are not quite as strong and will need a bit of reinforcement, but there's quite a lot in there, and similarly for industry. The plans for power generation have a commitment to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and continuing to develop and getting our power generation system down to zero emissions by 2035, which is ambitious and appropriate. The one area where it really is quite vague is the changes that will be needed to agriculture and land use. So that's an area that we think they still need quite a lot of focus on. But nevertheless, this is the first country to do this, and I think there's more to celebrate than to criticize. But it is still at the moment quite high level, and we really do need to see how these high level policies will actually turn into action on the ground. And that's, of course, what the Committee on Climate Change will be doing now as we go forward. It will be monitoring very, very closely the government's delivery of the policies and how much impact they are making on our path to net zero. So just three final thoughts for you. This is, I think, a good reminder that we need both to mitigate and to adapt. It's no point in having all this fancy new technology to help us have zero emission cars if we don't remember that the climate is changing and we need to take into account, and in this case, flooding. We also need, when we're thinking about solutions for climate change, we also need to think about fairness and vulnerability. Change are those who have contributed least, those who are least able to pay, those who are most vulnerable. So we need to be thinking in what we do about how do we support them, and making sure the things we do don't actually make life worse for them. And let me finish finally with a quote from Greta Thunberg. This is one of my favorite quotes from Greta, which is, "This needs cathedral thinking. We can build the foundations without knowing exactly how we will complete the roof." This is about, we need to get started. We absolutely don't have to know exactly what the solutions in 2050 are going to be. The more new technologies we have between now and 2050, the cheaper the solution to this problem is likely to get. So if they'd hung around waiting to start building Salisbury Cathedral until they knew exactly what it was going to look like, they'd never have started. So we need to get on. It took them nearly 300 years. We've only got 30. So we absolutely need action now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Baroness Brown, for what a thought-provoking and stimulating lecture this evening. I've already seen there are lots of questions coming up, but I just wanted to thank you personally for the approach that you've taken here, really clear, taking us through the really significant societal challenges that this creates, the inequalities that we have an obligation to address, and the future that technology can also help out here. I think there are many positives that we can learn, and coming together to greet these challenges, I think, is going to be the only way that we're going to resolve them. So I'm going to pass over to Professor Howell Thomas, who's going to handle some questions for us. Thank you very much indeed again, and thank you, Howell, for taking the questions for us.
Thank you, Helen. Usually when you take on this role, you do wonder a little bit if there are going to be any questions. I'm sure we've all been in that space at some time, but after such a clear lecture and such an important topical subject, there's absolutely no doubt about that. We've actually got 17 questions here for you. We're operating, Baroness Brown, on the system that those that gained the most votes are the ones that are going to be asked. So that I'll just follow that rule and start with then the question that's actually had 11 votes. And it's a Swansea University-based question. It's from my very good friend and colleague, Professor David Worsley, who says, at Swansea, we are working hard on active buildings, which can generate more power than they use. Much of this is for new buildings. So his question is, how do you think we should address the existing housing stock and not create a situation where what he's talking about is only the preserve of the wealthy? So a little bit about, you know, this question that you raised at the end about the sort of poverty side as well.
Well, first of all, that sounds like a brilliant thing to be doing. So I really look forward to hearing more about active buildings. That sounds very, very exciting. Secondly, I think we need to be focusing government money on where people can't afford to do things for themselves. So I think, you know, things like the programs to help get buildings to net zero. I feel the government should be focusing more money on local authorities, for local authorities to work with housing associations and council housing to make sure we prioritize the subsidy on those sorts of homes and those sorts of families. Local authorities tend to know very well where their areas of deprivation are, where people need the most help, and where they should be focusing that sort of support. So for me, I would like to see more devolution of funding for the transition down to local areas so that we can get that really local focus.
Thank you for that. I'll move on then to the next question, and this one has 9 votes. So from the audience, it's basically a question about nuclear power. What role do you see for nuclear power in the UK and worldwide?
Well, that for us on the Climate Change Committee, that really depends on how much it costs. The reason why it doesn't appear as in a very major way in our core scenarios is simply that we don't see the kind of cost reduction that we're seeing in renewables. It is of value to have some nuclear on the system because the more diverse the energy system in terms of different kinds of generation, the easier it is to accommodate periods of low wind, periods of very low temperatures, all of the fluctuations we see in both demand and supply. The more diverse your system is, the greater your ability to respond to those. So we do see maintaining the sort of level of nuclear we have on the system at the moment in our scenarios. And we do have some scenarios with high nuclear where the cost of nuclear comes down very fast, for example, through the development of small modular reactors. But we think the most probable scenarios are ones where we keep nuclear at roughly the level it is today, which requires significant replacement. But what really grows fast is the renewables in our scenarios. But as I say, if nuclear, the cost of nuclear comes down faster than we anticipate, then future scenarios will show a higher presence of nuclear. And that's part of this issue of the cathedral thinking. We haven't got to know exactly what the energy system of 2050 looks like. We just have to know it's zero carbon.
Thank you so much. Now, the next question is from Jennifer Rudd, and I think it's fair to say, Baroness Brown, that Jennifer does not share quite your enthusiasm for hydrogen. So let me read the question. Where is all this magic hydrogen coming from? Question mark. Blue hydrogen has to come from methane, which requires CCS to be available at scale with the at in capital letters, which it isn't. If green hydrogen, more promising, but I don't think we have enough electrolyzers available to generate the quantity of H2 that was suggested. And the final part of the question, how are the carbon emissions for creating the CCS tech and the electrolyzer tech being calculated and incorporated into these models?
Well, the hydrogen in our models doesn't start to rise significantly until the 2030s, but it does start in a small way in the 2020s. So she's absolutely right. We don't currently have enough electrolyzers to make large quantities of hydrogen, but we have got some some very lively electrolyzer companies. We've got companies like ITM Power making PEM electrolyzers. We've got Ceres Power developing high temperature electrolyzers. So this could be an extremely valuable industry for the UK going forward. And I think we see that we could be now starting to make green hydrogen as the carbon capture and storage clusters develop. We'll be in a position to start to make blue hydrogen with carbon capture and storage. And she's right that we will need very high standards for that to make sure that we really are getting to very high capture rates. By the time we get to 2050, the core scenario that the Climate Change Committee have developed has slightly more green hydrogen than blue, but it does still have both. And I think that's probably important, because if you think you'd like to go all green hydrogen, you find you have to expand your electricity system enormously, and we're already growing it by 2 to 2.5 times. If you start thinking you're going to have to grow it 4 or 5 times because you want all your hydrogen to be green, that begins to look rather unrealistic. If you then think, well, we might have all the hydrogen as being blue, you end up importing an enormous amount of gas, and that then undermines your energy security. So I think a balance of the two, but making sure that we have the highest possible standards for developing the blue hydrogen.
Thank you so much. Back to nuclear now. Do you believe nuclear fusion has potential to become a realistic source for electricity? This may lead to generation of unlimited, cheap and clean electricity.
I think it has potential, and I hope we will see sometime over the next 20 years or so, we will see that potential really demonstrated. That potential has not yet been demonstrated. And when you look at the potential cost of the equipment to produce it, I think we're a long way from it being really low cost and of infinite quantity. That was what was said about fission when that was back in the 1950s, and that didn't come to fruition. So I hope we will see fusion develop. I suspect it will be at a scale at a serious power generation scale, I suspect that is 2050 onwards. But if it comes sooner than that, it can only be a good thing.
Okay, thank you. I'll just keep presenting these questions to you, Baroness Brown. They've all got a significant number of votes. So these are sort of collective questions from groups in the audience. Thank you for taking them all in your stride and answering them as you are. The next one is back to Professor David Worsley with another question: is what opportunities are there for using waste heat in better ways from industry, using some interesting new materials like thermochemical and phase change materials? And then he adds, somewhere like Port Talbot, that Port Talbot Works produces enough waste heat to support several 100,000 homes, as an example.
Well, I think he's answered his own question. We need to get much better at using waste heat. And he's absolutely right. That's about kind of resource and energy efficiency, basically. And it should be, those should be the things we try and do first, in a way. And of course, it's also a real benefit. For example, if you're going to use a high temperature electrolyzer to produce hydrogen, the availability of waste heat very significantly improves the efficiency of the process, just as it does for many other processes. So I think what he's telling us is that he's got some interesting solutions, and I'm very pleased to hear that.
Good, thank you. So a second question from Jennifer Rudd, who asked a question about the hydrogen. This time it's a question about beef and dairy. And again, it's a sort of challenging the position, really. Why is there no aim to reduce beef and dairy? This seems ludicrous, given that we've been told repeatedly by the CCC, and is it UK Fires, if I'm reading that correctly, that reduction of meat in our diet is important. We can have fewer cows that are kept in better conditions and are used more ecologically.
Well, I would agree with her, and so would the CCC, and so would the CCC's chairman, Lord Deben, that we should be eating less and better quality meat. And that would be a very good thing in this country, and it would be good for our health, as Helen Griffiths has looked at in her research in the past, and it would be better for the climate and help free up the space for the rewilding, the new woodland and forests that we need. So the governments, of course, are always reluctant to tell people how to behave, and this is, for our current government, this is clearly a very sensitive area of telling people that they should think about changing their diets. Although actually the government's own healthy eating guidelines do recommend a very significant reduction of meat and dairy in our diets.
Well, the last part of that answer leads me very nicely into the next question, actually, which is, what plans are in place to support the behavioral changes required for our transition to net zero?
Well,
it appears that our success.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I was going to say that would be one of my sort of most significant criticisms of the government's net zero strategy, is that it doesn't really tackle that. It has some high-level principles, but it doesn't really get stuck into how do we deal with the behavioral change. And that's something that I think, is probably best done at local level. So I do think it's something that government should be funding local authorities to be working on. And I think it's also something that we should be looking at. What are we teaching in schools and also in universities to make sure people have a better understanding of the kind of behavior change that makes a difference.
Thank you. That question is from Julian Steer, I should have said. Again, if I just follow on from your last comment, that take me to a question by Chris Morgans, which is about training. So it's upskilling, training, and redeployment will be as important as technology and innovation. What changes do you think are needed to our education systems and training provisions to deliver the people needed to make net zero a reality?
Well, first of all, I think we need to do. The government is talking about. In fact, there was a meeting earlier today with ministers about changes to the curriculum to introduce more climate education. And there was a bill being introduced into the House of Commons yesterday, a bill that's been written by school children about climate education. So I hope we're going to see a much stronger focus of getting climate education and climate understanding throughout the school curriculum. But then there is a challenge of, I think, of both retraining and appropriate training, particularly, I think, in our technical colleges, to make sure that we're starting to move from training, the technicians who can work on internal combustion engines to the technicians who can work on electric vehicles. I have an electric car. We had a problem with it, and we had a real problem because the technician at our local dealership who dealt with electric vehicles was on holiday, and they didn't have anybody else. So there's already a growing need. And so I think we need a much bigger focus on the right training, and then on retraining, and real support for people to retrain, because people are going to be capable of picking up these new skills. They just need the opportunities to do so.
Thank you. I'm conscious the clock. Sorry, I'm conscious the clock is ticking. So just for the audience, then I think we're heading towards the last one or two questions. The next one is from Stuart Irvin. The government seems to place a lot of reliance on offshore wind, with little attention given to solar, despite it becoming the cheapest source of electricity. What is the future role of solar?
I think solar has an important role, but of course we are a small country. We don't have that much space. I mean, you can see how little forest and woodland we have left in comparison to our other European neighbours. We just haven't got that much space for really major solar installations, and I know how controversial it is in Cambridgeshire when a farmer wants to convert part of the farmland to a solar farm. So I think that we should continue to develop solar and onshore wind, but I think we need to recognise we just haven't got that much space for enormous quantities of it. Whereas we do have an absolutely brilliant offshore wind resource, and as we move to floating wind and are able to have wind on both sides of the country, so not just the North Sea, but also the Celtic Sea on the Welsh side of the country, then actually we will have a much better wind resource, because we'll be picking up different wind systems, and so we will actually get it'll be better from the point of view of balancing the grid and not being in danger when one particular system has a low patch of having very low wind generation, for example. So I think we will see exciting developments on your side of the country too, in the wind area, in the next 10 to 15 years.
Thank you so much. We finished with a very general question, which I ask you to respond to. It says, do you think that economic growth is necessary to human happiness?
I think in some countries it is. I suspect it isn't in our country. And I think one of the most powerful things I've seen on that recently is the Dasgupta review, produced for the Treasury by Sapatha Dasgupta and published earlier this year, which is about valuing nature. And Professor Dasgupta points out that the growth of our economy is intricately bound with nature, and we've been exploiting nature for free for far too long. And he points out that there is a limit to growth on our economy, and we're getting to the stage where we're going to hit it, because at the moment, the rate at which our economy is growing and the number of us is growing means that nature isn't able to regenerate itself. And once you get to that position, we're sort of using nature up, then we have to recognize we're approaching a really serious limit to growth.
Well, I suggest we bring the Q&A session to an end at that point, and to thank you very much indeed, Baroness Brown, for taking the questions. I'd like to apologize to members of the audience who did submit questions, but we weren't able to get around to them. But thank you very much indeed for putting those questions in front of us. It's my very pleasant duty now to perform an experiment. It's only carried out in Swansea once a year, and it's transportation of the medal to the speaker. And I'm hoping, keeping fingers crossed, we've been successful again this year with that experiment. And it's my great honor to present you with the medal, the Zienkiewicz medal for the lecture. So
thank you very much. It's very, very beautiful. Hope you can. I hope you can see it.
Yeah, definitely.
There it is. So thank you so much. And I should say to people, it's a marvelous, heavy, I think gold-plated chunk of silver. It's absolutely stunning, and it weighs a lot. It feels very special indeed. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed once again for your presentation and speech and taking the questions. And it's now my pleasure to hand over to Professor Ken Mason for the formal vote of thanks and to draw the evening to a close. Over to you, Ken.
Super, thanks, Howell. And Baroness Brown, on behalf of Swansea University, as well as the Faculty of Science and Engineering, I would really like to thank you for taking this time to spend with us and for really giving us such a challenging lecture. You've really highlighted how much work needs to be done and really how the solutions really span across all of society. So thank you very much for that. As a small token of our thanks, and with the assistance of the Royal Mail, we would also like to present you with a hamper. I have not been quite as successful as Hal was with the medal. I do believe it's been delivered to your greenhouse in Cambridge. But please enjoy some of the treats from Wales when you get back home there. And I think now we'd have normally a virtual round of applause here. So give everybody in the audience a chance to clap for a second here. So we can have Howell clapping there. Thank you. So in addition, I'd like to thank everybody who made this year's lecture possible, especially the Zienkiewicz Lecture Committee and Sam Board, without whom this would not have gone nearly as smoothly. I'd like to also thank our VC, Paul Boyle, who could not be here this evening, but sends his best regards for supporting the lecture, as well as Arasu, Helen, and Howell for hosting the lecture and the question and answer section. And finally, on behalf of Swansea University, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. And thank you for all the wonderful and challenging questions. I think the Baroness handled them wonderfully, but there were some good challenges in there. And finally, like I said, look forward to seeing everybody and your friends next year at the 6th Zienkiewicz Lecture, which with any luck, we can have in person as well as online. But thank you, Baroness Brown, again. And thank you to everybody, and have a great evening.
Thank you, and so sorry not to be there with you.
Another year. So, thanks, everybody.